Let's open the case file on history's most famous missing place. I'm talking, of course, about the lost city of Atlantis. For centuries, that single name has conjured up these incredible images, right? A shimmering, hyper-advanced utopia just resting quietly at the bottom of the ocean. Well, in today's explainer, we're going to look completely past the pop culture myths, the sci-fi movies, and definitely those wild internet conspiracies. Instead, we're going to dig into the actual grounded sources and real archaeological evidence to finally demystify what Atlantis actually is, and maybe more importantly, what it absolutely isn't. Okay, let's dive right into this. I really want you to step into the shoes of a modern explorer for just a second. Just imagine looking out at the vast open Atlantic Ocean, or maybe endlessly scanning satellite imagery of the Sahara Desert, totally desperate to find this sunken utopia. I mean, the promise of discovering some ancient, hyper-advanced civilization that just literally vanished overnight, it's incredibly alluring, isn't it? But to figure out where Atlantis might actually be hiding today, we first have to figure out exactly where the story came from in the first place. So, kicking things off with Plato's Tale of Two Cities. To launch the very first phase of our investigation, we basically need to return to the scene of the crime. We have to go back and examine the only original witness statements that even exist for this place.
Because here is what so many people just don't realize. There is absolutely no ancient cultural memory of Atlantis outside of one single guy. Literally, every single mention of Atlantis in all of human history traces back to just two works written by the Greek philosopher Plato, specifically the Timaeus and the Critias, which he wrote right around 360 BC. Now, in these writings, Plato claims that a statesman named Solon visited Egypt sometime around 590 BC, and while he was there, Egyptian priests supposedly translated these ancient, secret records of Atlantis directly to him.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really crucial point. Plato's story? It wasn't actually a solo feature about Atlantis at all. It was a tale of two cities. You see, Plato was setting up this massive direct contrast. On one hand, he described Atlantis as this unlimited, insanely greedy naval empire from the west. They were supposedly descended from the god Poseidon, but over time, their divine blood had basically become diluted by base, corrupt human nature. And on the other side of this conflict, an idealized, super ancient version of Athens, this completely virtuous, perfect land power. Essentially, what Plato was doing was using this huge fictional conflict to show the absolute superiority of his own concept of an ideal state, which, if you know your philosophy, he'd already outlined in his earlier work, The Republic. Moving on to the fall of Atlantis. This brings us right to the incredibly dramatic climax of Plato's whole tale. So the greedy Atlanteans decide to launch this massive, unprovoked invasion against Athens and the rest of Europe. But against all odds, the virtuous Athenians stand totally alone and actually defeat them. But as you might guess, the gods aren't quite done with Atlantis yet. To punish their profound hubris and their greed, the gods decide to unleash absolute devastation. I'm actually going to read Plato's exact words here because they are pretty intense. But afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. I mean, wow, it's just incredible narrative flair, isn't it? It's dramatic, it's completely apocalyptic, and truthfully, it's the exact moment a global myth was born. But hey, before we start organizing a massive scuba expedition, we really have to look at the timeline Plato actually gives us here. Because frankly, it is completely absurd. Plato claimed that this highly advanced naval empire existed 9,000 years before Solon even heard this story. Guys, that puts Atlantis squarely at around 9,600 BC. Let's just put that into perspective for a second. 9,000 years before Plato puts humanity solidly, and I mean solidly, in the Stone Age. We were literally just barely getting started with basic agriculture. There were no cities, there were absolutely no advanced civilizations, and there was definitely no massive naval empire sailing around waging war against a virtuous Athens, mainly because ancient Athens didn't even exist yet. So, getting into philosophy, not geography. Since the timeline is literally a physical impossibility, we have to shift our investigation. We need to move away from literal geography and start looking at the actual, real motive behind the story. And this is where pretty much all classical scholars broadly agree. Atlantis is simply an allegory. It was this elaborate, brilliant piece of philosophical fiction invented by Plato to warn his contemporaries. He was warning them against the hubris of nations, against political corruption, and against unchecked imperialism. Honestly, he was most likely using it to heavily critique the real-life Athenian naval empire of his own time, because that very real hubris had just recently led them right into the devastating Peloponnesian Wars. Now, what's really interesting about this is how later thinkers interpreted Plato's work. Jump ahead 8 centuries after Plato, and you have this 5th century Neoplatonist philosopher named Proclus. Now, Proclus saw the story of Atlantis not as literal history at all, but as this grand allegorical representation of the entire cosmos. For Proclus, the epic war between Athens and Atlantis represented what he called a second demiurgy, basically the massive cosmic clash in the universe between form and matter, between the limit and the unlimited. The whole thing was just a grand philosophical riddle. It was never intended to be a treasure map. Which brings us to Hunting the Lost City. Because despite this incredibly clear philosophical intent, by the time the 19th century rolled around, the story bizarrely transformed into a literal global treasure hunt. And that wild goose chase leads us right to our modern lineup of suspects. All right, let's open case file number 1, the Greek island of Santorini. So right around 1600 BC, this island suffered a massive, catastrophic volcanic eruption. It literally blew the entire center out of the island and caused these absolutely devastating tsunamis across the Mediterranean. So naturally, for years, many have speculated that this very real-life disaster is what originally inspired the Atlantis myth.
But let's really interrogate this suspect for a minute. While it is very possible, maybe even likely, that 1400 years of oral history managed to preserve a cultural memory of a great civilization destroyed by natural disaster, current scholarship basically proves this just doesn't fit the Atlantis bill. For starters, the eruption didn't actually cause the immediate overnight collapse of the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete, which the myth absolutely requires. Plus, the timeline is just completely wrong for Plato's 9,000-year claim. And worse, trying to make it fit totally ignores the deep political message Plato was actually trying to send.
Let's move to case file number 2 and see how this builds. Doñana National Park in Spain. This area is often linked to the ancient, mysterious civilization of Tartessos. Now, because Plato specifically mentioned that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what we call the Strait of Gibraltar today, and that it faced Cadiz, a lot of researchers have looked straight to the huge, rectangular valley of the Guadalquivir River in coastal Spain. But here's the problem. While this location superficially fits some of Plato's geographic descriptions, like yes, it is a very large rectangular plain, the actual geology of the area reveals a totally swampy, prehistoric landscape. And, much more importantly, archaeologists have searched this area extensively, and they have found absolutely zero evidence of an advanced, sunken utopian capital hiding out in the mud. And that brings us to case file number 3. Now, this is a suspect that has become incredibly popular all over the internet lately, the Richat structure. It's also known as the Eye of Africa, and it's located way out in Mauritania. And I will admit, it is stunning. It's this massive 40-kilometer-wide circular feature right in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and it genuinely looks exactly like giant concentric rings.
People absolutely love to cherry-pick details here. They'll point out, excitedly, that Plato described Atlantis as having concentric rings of water and land, and they'll even go so far as trying to match the exact color of the rocks out there. But honestly, this completely ignores actual reality. Geologists had definitively proven that the Richat structure is a deeply ancient, entirely natural igneous intrusion. It's literally just a giant magma dome that has slowly eroded over millions and millions of years. Furthermore, it's hundreds of miles inland, in a desert, which completely contradicts Plato's very specific oceanic setting. And as for the archaeology, the only artifacts ever found there are Acheulean Stone Age tools. There are no advanced ruins, no ancient canals, and definitely no sunken empire.
So, why the myth endures? This brings us right to the final verdict of our investigation. We've looked at the original text, we've broken down the impossible timeline, we've explored the deep philosophy, and we've interrogated the modern suspects. So, the crucial point we really have to land on is simply this: 0. In well over a century of incredibly dedicated searching using advanced technology, deep-sea submarines, and high-tech satellites, exactly 0 artifacts, 0 pottery shards, and absolutely 0 ruins of Atlantis have ever been found. And you want to know why? Because there was never any reason to expect they would be. Atlantis was just never meant to be found on a physical map. Its true value lies exactly where Plato left it over 2 millennia ago, firmly embedded in his original warning about moral decline, the ultimate corruption of power, and the dangerous hubris of nations.
In the modern era, we've somehow taken this brilliant, profound piece of classical philosophy and we've totally reduced it to a wild goose chase for blurry satellite anomalies and cool-looking rock formations. Which really leaves us with one final, fascinating question to ponder as we close out this explainer. If the evidence so overwhelmingly shows that Atlantis was just a fictional allegory, why is humanity still so deeply, stubbornly obsessed with finding a utopia that never actually existed? What does our relentless search for some lost, perfect past actually say about how we view our own present? I'll leave you to think about that one. Thanks so much for joining me on this investigation.